Welcome to our ultimate masterclass on Surendranath Dasgupta's monumental history of Indian philosophy. Today we embark on an exhaustive journey through the entirety of Volume 1. Master Dasgupta begins by stating that the true history of India is not one of political conquests. Could you elaborate?
Indeed. Dasgupta emphatically points out that the unity of India is not to be sought in the rise and fall of empires, or the invasions of the Greeks, Huns, and Mughals. These political events were like hurricanes, mere physical phenomena that never breached the spiritual integrity of Hindu culture. The core of this civilization is entirely philosophical.
So philosophy was the ultimate pursuit?
Precisely. Philosophy was regarded as the highest goal of all practical and theoretical activities. Furthermore, it is a grave misconception to think of Indian philosophy as dreamy or abstract. It is intensely rigorous, and most problems debated in modern Western philosophy occurred in highly analytic forms to these ancient thinkers.
If this philosophy is so rigorous, why is it often misunderstood, even by Western historians like Frank Thilly, who called it merely mythological?
Such uninformed beliefs stem from the sheer difficulty of the texts. Ancient scholars never tried to popularize philosophy. It was reserved for the adhikari, the fit student. The literature uses highly condensed expressions and an intricate web of technical terms.
And the development of the systems is also quite unique, isn't it?
Very unique. In Western philosophy, one system often supersedes another. In India, systems like Nyaya, Samkhya, and Vedanta developed side by side over centuries. They were formulated in pithy half sentences called sutras. Over generations, scholars wrote exhaustive commentaries, and then commentaries on those commentaries, continuously refining their logic against rival schools.
Let us begin at the source, Chapter 2, covering the Vedas and Brahmanas. What exactly are the Vedas?
The Vedas are universally believed to be the earliest literary record of the Indo-European race. Ascertaining their exact date is difficult. Max Muller guessed 1200 BC, while Bal Gangadhar Tilak pushed it back to 4000 BC. They were never written down initially, but were, Shruti, revelations handed down from mouth to mouth with scrupulous zeal.
How is this vast literature classified?
The primary collections are the four Samhitas. The Rigveda contains the earliest hymns to nature gods. The Samaveda is a book of chants. The Yajurveda contains sacrificial formulas. And the Atharvaveda represents a more primitive stage of thought, teeming with spells, charms, and incantations appealing to the demon world.
Following the hymns, we have the Brahmanas. What was the focus of this era?
The Brahmans are prose treatises where all intellectual activity was concentrated intensely on the sacrifice. The sacrifice was conceived as a kind of magical machinery. The slightest mispronunciation could reverse the effect. It was believed that the unalterable cosmic law, called Rata, guaranteed the results of these rituals. This is where we find the very first rudiments of the law of karma.
But this ritualism eventually gave way to meditation.
Yes, through the Aranyakas, or forest treatises. Old men retiring to the forest could not perform elaborate sacrifices. So, physical sacrifices were replaced by symbolic meditations. For example, instead of sacrificing a real horse, the visible universe itself was meditated upon as a horse. This subjective speculation paved the way for the Upanishads.
Before we reach the Upanishads, how did the Vedic people view their gods? Was it strict polytheism?
Not exactly. Max Muller called it henotheism or catnotheism. The poets hypostatized forces of nature, like Agni the fire or Vata the wind. Whichever deity they worshipped at the moment was extolled as the absolute supreme, while the others disappeared from the mind. It was a fluid state between polytheism and monotheism.
Did a single creator god eventually emerge?
Yes, this tendency brought forth concepts like Prajapati, Vishwakarman, and Hiranyagarbha, a supreme lord. Meanwhile, the word Brahman, which originally meant a magical formula or the power of the sacrifice, was slowly abstracted. It eventually came to signify the supreme, infinite power of the universe.
We now step into Chapter 3, the earlier Upanishads, composed between 700 and 600 BC. I have heard theories by Western scholars like Richard Garby suggesting this philosophy was invented by the Kshatriya warrior caste, not the Brahmins. Is that true?
Dasgupta strongly refutes Garbe's theory. Garbe relies on a few stories where kings instructed Brahmins. But these were rare exceptions. The truth is that earnest philosophical enquiry gripped the entire cultured class, breaking down considerations of birth and sex.
What was the core shift in their thinking?
It was a radical leap. They completely shifted the center of interest from an objective, external creator like Vishwakarman to the subjective self. But they struggled initially, trying to identify Brahman with the sun, the moon, or the vital breath. They documented these failures to show how difficult it was to reach the true, formless reality.
If all positive definitions failed, how did the sages describe Brahman?
They realized that whatever we can experience or express is limited by conceptual thought. To give utterance to the unutterable, they could only say what it was not. The great sage Yagyavalkya declared, "He the Atman is not this, nor this, neti neti. He is inconceivable, unchangeable, untouched."
So language completely fails.
Absolutely. There is a famous story where Vashkali asked the sage Behva to expound the nature of Brahman. Behva remained absolutely silent. When Vashkali pressed him a third time, Behva answered, "I teach you indeed, but you do not understand. The Atman is silence."
We often hear the equation Atman equals Brahman. But the word Atman seems to be used in various ways. How do the Upanishads uncover the true Atman?
They peel it back through 5 sheaths. First is the Annamaya Atman, the physical body of food. Behind that is the Pranamaya Atman, the vital breath. Deeper still is the Manomaya Atman, the self consisting of will and mind. Behind the mind is the Vijnanamaya Atman, consciousness.
And the final essence?
The final essence, hiding behind all these sheaths, is the Anandamaya Atman, the self as pure bliss. The texts declare, "Truly he is the rapture, for who could breathe, if this space was not bliss?"
There is also the story of Indra and Prajapati exploring the states of consciousness, isn't there?
Yes. Prajapati first tells Indra the self is the physical body. Indra realizes the body is vulnerable to death. Next, Prajapati says it is the dream self. Indra sees the dream self still suffers and weeps. Third, Prajapati says it is the state of deep, dreamless sleep.
But Indra wasn't satisfied with deep sleep either.
No, Indra was terrified, saying, "In deep sleep he is destroyed and lost." Finally, Prajapati reveals the ultimate truth: the body is merely the support. The true self is the pure, subject-objectless consciousness that witnesses all 3 states but is bound by none of them.
How did the Upanishads formulate the cycle of rebirth and ultimate emancipation?
They developed the doctrines of Pitrayana, the way of the fathers leading to rebirth, and Devyana, the way of the gods leading to Brahman. But crucially, they identified desire, or karma, as the root cause of rebirth. Karma merely serves as the connecting link between desire and its fruition.
So how is moksha, or emancipation, achieved?
Emancipation is not a new acquisition or a product of any action. We are always emancipated and free in our true nature. We suffer only because of ignorance. When true self-knowledge wipes away this ignorance, the fetters of the heart break asunder, and the mortal becomes immortal.
Moving to Chapter 4, we look at the general observations on the Indian systems. How are these schools broadly classified?
The Hindus classify the systems into two groups, the Nastika, which reject the authority of the Vedas, namely the Buddhists, Jains, and Charvakas, and the Astika, the six orthodox systems, Samkhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa, and Vedant.
Did they all agree on anything?
Yes, despite their fierce logical battles, they share four fundamental agreements: the karma theory, the doctrine of mukti, the doctrine of a transcendent soul, and a pessimistic diagnosis of worldly life coupled with an optimistic faith in ultimate liberation.
Let us dive into Chapter 5, Buddhist Philosophy. What was the philosophical climate in India just before the Buddha?
Philosophy had reached a deadlock. On one hand, there was the rigid sacrificial karma of the Brahmins. On the other, extreme heresies. The Charvakas were pure materialists who denied the soul and the afterlife, claiming consciousness was just a byproduct of matter, like the intoxicating power in molasses.
Were there others who denied moral responsibility?
Yes. Makhali Goshala, leader of the Ajivakas, preached strict determinism, that human effort is meaningless and everything is driven by blind fate. Another sophist, Ajita Keskambali, taught that there is no fruit of good or evil deeds, and everything ends at death. It was at this juncture that the Buddha erected a completely original superstructure of thought.
How did Gautama the Buddha arrive at his realization?
Born around 560 BC, he was sheltered by his royal father. But upon seeing an old man, a diseased man, a dead man, and a monk, he was distressed by the impermanence of life. He forsook his home, practiced extreme asceticism for 6 years, realized its futility, and finally attained supreme enlightenment.
And his teachings are preserved in the Pali scriptures?
Yes, collected centuries later into 3 pitkas or baskets: the Sutta, dealing with doctrines, the Vinaya, dealing with monastic discipline, and the Abhidhamma, which is a scholastic and technical elaboration of the Sutta doctrines. The Suttas themselves are divided into 5 great collections, or Nikayas.
What was the central doctrine the Buddha discovered to explain the origin of sorrow?
It is the magnificent doctrine of Pratitya Samutpada, or dependent origination. It explains how sorrow comes into being through 12 interdependent links. It starts with Avijja, or ignorance, which produces Sankhara, the karmic confirmations of past lives.
How do these past karmas create a new life?
These produce Vijnana, the germ of consciousness descending into the womb, which brings together Namarupa, mind and body. This leads to the 6 senses: contact, feeling, and tanha, or craving. Craving leads to Upadana, or grasping, which leads to bhava, or becoming, resulting in birth, old age, and death.
Did the Buddha accept the Upanishadic concept of a permanent soul?
Emphatically no. The Buddha stated that when people claim they feel self, they are merely experiencing one or more of the 5 khandhas, or aggregates. There is no permanent reality, only passing states.
What are these 5 khandhas?
They are Rupa, matter and sense data; Vedana, feeling; Sanna, conceptual knowledge; Sankhara, synthetic mental states or volitions; and Vijnana, consciousness. Just as a chariot is but a conventional name for an assembly of wheels and poles, a person is just an assembly of these 5 changing khandhas. There is no enduring I am.
If we are just passing states driven by ignorance, how do we stop the cycle?
Ignorance is fueled by asavas, or depravities, the influx of lust, desire for existence, and heretical views. To loosen these tangles, the Buddha prescribed Shila, Samadhi, and Panna. Shila, is right discipline, ceasing all sinful deeds.
And how is the mind concentrated in samadhi?
The sage passes through 4 jhanas. The first involves discursive meditation and steady bliss. In the second, discursive thought ceases. In the third, the sage becomes indifferent even to bliss. In the fourth, both happiness and misery vanish, leaving absolute, supreme indifference. This brings panna, true wisdom, destroying craving and leading to nirvana.
How did early Buddhism view karma?
Karma is divided into actions of body, speech, and mind. But the absolute root of all karma is cetana, or volition. A mere bad thought is a mental karma. However, karma by itself, without tanha, or craving, is incapable of bearing fruit. When craving ceases, the deeds of an arhat bear no fruit.
And what exactly is nirvana?
It is the absolute cessation of sorrow resulting from the destruction of desires. Early Buddhism refused to answer whether it was a state of eternal existence or annihilation, viewing such metaphysical questions as illegitimate heresies. It is simply the cessation of the phenomenal flow.
How did this highly practical, anti-metaphysical teaching split into different schools?
Over centuries, the Theravada school, often called Hinayana by its critics, split into numerous sects like the Sarvastivadins. But around 200 BC, a massive shift occurred with the emergence of Mahayana scriptures.
What defined the Mahayana, or great vehicle?
Philosophically, they deduced that if there is no permanent soul, and all phenomena are changing, then all things must be mere void and non-essential appearances. Ethically, their goal was not personal salvation, but the salvation of all beings. The Bodhisattva delays his own nirvana to help an infinite number of souls.
Who were the great thinkers of this Mahayana movement?
Ashvaghosha, around 80 AD, introduced the Tathata, or thatness, philosophy. He held that the ultimate entity is an uncreate, eternal oneness. The soul as birth and death comes forth from this Tathagat womb, creating the Alaya Vijnana, the all-conserving mind.
How does it produce the illusory world?
Through a process of interperfuming. Just as wine stirs up waves on a calm ocean, the wind of ignorance stirs up the pure mind. The waves of mentality make their appearance as the subjective ego and the objective external world. When ignorance is annihilated, the ocean of pure wisdom remains unmolested.
Did Nagarjuna agree with this absolute thatness?
No. Nagarjuna developed Shunyavada, or nihilism. He applied a relentless dialectic to prove that nothing has any essence. Because things depend on causes, they have no intrinsic nature. A thing cannot originate by itself, by others, by both, or without cause. Therefore, there is no real origination and no real destruction.
If everything is false, then even his own arguments are false.
Exactly. Nagarjuna admitted this. The Madhyamikas have no thesis of their own to support. They only find fault with all other theses. They admit a relative truth, Samvriti Satya, for daily life, but from the absolute standpoint, the ultimate truth is absolute silence.
And how did the Vijnanavada school, the Yogacaras, respond to this absolute void?
Led by thinkers like Asanga and Vasubandhu, they agreed that all external substances are imaginary. But they argued, since we only ever come into touch with knowledge, knowledge alone exists. There is no external world. The mind, accustomed to creating appearances from beginningless time, projects the illusion of an external world.
So both the perceiver and the perceived are just ideas?
Yes. The Alaya Vijnana dances in its diverse operations, constructing the illusions of subject and object. The ultimate truth is Tathagat Garbha, a state completely free from all conceptual creations and limitations.
What about the Sautrantikas? How did they explain perception if everything is momentary?
Dharmakirti defined valid perception as nirvikalpa, grasping the unique individuality of the object in a single flash, unassociated with names. The subsequent conceptual activity, associating names and universals, is savikalpa and technically erroneous imagination.
And how did they prove absolute momentariness?
Ratnakirti argued that existence is defined solely by arthakriyakaritva, the capacity to produce an effect. If a seed produces a shoot today, its capacity changes every moment, therefore, the entity itself must be different every moment. Identity is merely a false impression caused by similarity.
Let us turn to Chapter 6, the Jaina philosophy. Is Jainism just a branch of Buddhism, as some early European scholars suspected?
Not at all. Jainism is at least as old as Buddhism, if not older. Mahavir, the last prophet, was a contemporary of the Buddha, but he was the 24th Tirthankar of an already existing tradition. His predecessor Paraswa lived 250 years earlier.
Are there different sects within Jainism?
Yes, primarily two, the Shvetambaras, who wear white clothes, and the Digambaras, who remain naked, believing that owning even clothes prevents moksha. They share the same fundamental creed but possess different sacred texts written in Jaina Prakrit.
How did the Jains view reality compared to the Buddhists and the Upanishadic sages?
The Upanishads claimed only the unchangeable substance is true. The Buddhists claimed there is no permanent substance, only momentary passing qualities. The Jains declared both are extreme, one-sided views contrary to experience.
How did they reconcile these extremes?
Experience shows that in all changes, new qualities are generated, old ones destroyed, but a part remains permanent. When a gold jug is melted into a ring, the shape changes, but the gold persists. Being involves permanence associated with change. This is their doctrine of Anakantavada, or relative pluralism.
Does this mean truth depends on the standpoint from which we view it?
Exactly. The Jains categorized these standpoints as nayas. For instance, Sangrahanaya looks at things purely from their most general aspect as being. This is the Vedantic error. Riju views things only as momentary collocations of qualities. This is the Buddhist error.
So other systems are just taking one Nyaya and claiming it is the absolute truth.
Precisely. The Jains believe affirmations from any single standpoint are true only conditionally. An infinite number of affirmations can be made about a thing from infinite points of view. To claim one is absolute is an error, a nilbhasa.
How does this lead to the famous Jaina Sayadvada?
Because things possess infinite characteristics, no single judgment is absolutely valid. Every affirmation should be preceded by syat, meaning in some sense. You must say syadaste, in some sense it is. And syannasti, in some sense it is not. A jug exists as a jug, but it does not exist as a cloth.
What if you assert both simultaneously?
If we try to assert both existence and non-existence simultaneously without emphasis, the nature of the thing becomes avaktavya, inconceivable or indescribable. These permutations combine to form the Saptabhangi, the 7 conditional affirmations.
How did the Jains view the soul, the GVA?
Unlike the Buddhists, the Jains believe in infinite souls. In their pure state, they possess infinite knowledge and bliss. Interestingly, they believe the soul expands or contracts to fit the dimensions of the body it occupies. Even microscopic clusters called nigodas are packed with souls.
And why are these souls bound?
Because of karma. But uniquely in Jainism, karma is actual, infraatomic particles of matter. The influx of this matter is asrava. Passions act like sticky substances, causing karma dust to stick to the soul, resulting in bandha or bondage. Salvation requires destroying this accumulated karma matter, called nirjara.
What are the non-living elements, the Vajiva, in Jainism?
There are 5 categories. First is Pujyala, or matter, made of eternal atoms. Then come to concepts unique to Jainism, dharma and adharma. Here, they do not mean merit and demerit. Dharma is the ontological principle of motion. It acts as a passive condition making motion possible, like water allows a fish to swim. Adharma is the pervasive entity that helps things keep at rest.
And the final 2?
Akasha is space, a positive entity allowing substances to interpenetrate. Kala, or time, consists of innumerable particles that do not mix, but facilitate the modification and change of qualities in atoms.
Did the Jains believe in a creator god to manage all these categories?
No, Jainism is strictly atheistic. They deployed Fier's logic to refute the Nyaya arguments for Ishvara. They argued that an eternal, bodiless God could not have the desire, movement, or organs necessary to create a physical world. They held that the universe is eternal, governed by its own natural laws and the moral order of karma.
How then is the ultimate goal, moksha, achieved?
Through Jnana Yoga, which consists of right knowledge, right faith, and right conduct, the foremost being ahimsa, absolute non-injury. When all karma is burnt away by meditation, the purified soul rises straight to the top of the mundane universe. There, devoid of the motion principle, dharma, it remains motionless forever in infinite knowledge and bliss.